She was a princess, at one time second in line to the throne of England, and he was one of London's most notorious and violent criminals. Together they would create one of the biggest hidden scandals in royal history, one that, if fully revealed at the time, could have rocked the monarchy to its foundations.
I think she found John very entertaining. I know there's always the speculation about did they, didn't they.
He boasted to me that he had had Margaret in Mustique.
This is the story of how a chance encounter on a Caribbean island between Princess Margaret and the West London gangster John Bindon triggered an extraordinary chain of events involving compromising photographs, rumours of private meetings at Kensington Palace, the Secret Service, and a High Court murder trial.
John took it out of his boot. It was like it was like a bayonet. It must have been that big. Just put it in him.
This is the story of the secret relationship between the princess and the gangster. It was 1974, and Princess Margaret was in her prime. Still regarded as one of the world's most beautiful and glamorous women, and married to the dashingly bohemian Lord Snowdon, stars of stage and screen sought her company. The press clamoured for pictures, and the public couldn't get enough. But the dream royal marriage had been a sham for nearly a decade, with Margaret and Snowdon having both had affairs. Margaret had cultivated relationships with several men outside of her marriage, like nightclub pianist Robin Douglas Hume. Rumours of yet more inappropriate liaisons were rife, but the public knew nothing about them.
The Palace press office was tearing their hair out. But they did have that great weapon on their side, that the British press proprietors were not prepared to overstep a certain mark, morally for their readers' sake, but really for their own sake to keep in with the royal family.
So with the press still keen in the early 70s not to offend the monarchy, Margaret was afforded a now unheard-of level of privacy to enjoy a love life out with her marriage. In 1973, she'd begun a passionate affair with Roddy Llewellyn, a man 17 years her junior. But less than 18 months into their relationship, Llewellyn, feeling the pressure of the affair, suddenly went backpacking in Turkey without telling the princess. Margaret had consoled herself by going on holiday to the Caribbean island of Mustique in the West Indies, a world away from the disapproving gaze of the British establishment.
Mustique, 3 miles long and a mile
Mustique
wide.
is a paradise of sun, sea and sand, and in Margaret's day was a private playground for the super rich.
Then a Caribbean playground has it all, and not much else.
I think Princess Margaret liked the island because the hoi polloi were not there. It was incredibly exclusive, the place. You really couldn't get on the island unless you had the permission of the owners of it.
Mustique was owned by the Honourable Colin Tennant, an eccentric Scottish aristocrat who was not only an ex-boyfriend of Margaret's, but had also set the princess up with Llewellyn the year before. So when she arrived on his island in December of 1974 without a male companion, Tennant was going to have his work cut out for him, ensuring that Mom was kept in high spirits.
It was Colin Tennant, who was the ringmaster, who arranged everything for Margaret. It was all, the whole island was orchestrated to deal with her needs. And that's the only thing the island thought about, was how to keep Margaret happy when she was there.
Mustique had a reputation as a hedonistic paradise, and exactly how much the princess enjoyed the exclusive island's pleasures had remained a closely guarded secret.
Did she behave badly? I don't know. Very few people from the outside world ever went there, but I think she most certainly drank too much. I think she had liaisons with male people, and she could get away, quite honestly, with murder, because nobody on the island was ever going to tell on her.
But that year, the princess was introduced to a new man on Mustique, a man with a dark and dangerous background, whom really shouldn't have been allowed anywhere near a member of the royal family. Several landmark British movies of the late 60s and early 70s, such as Poor Cow, Performance and Get Carter.
Biffo turns up literally with a stick and a kind of one of those kind of kerchiefs with his belongings in it, because you don't need very much in Mystique. You need a pair of shoes, swimming things, or a pair of shorts and a T-shirt. And that's all he had with him. He had nothing with him.
Bindon had a reputation as a highly entertaining storyteller, and as a show business type, he was deemed suitably amusing company to be introduced to Princess Margaret.
She was having a luncheon party, and we were invited to it. I just remember he was very taken with her, because she is the Queen's sister, was the Queen's sister, and had a certain magnetism about her. Because of his charm and his wit, he was so funny that I remember, you know, he could just take over. Even she would have been taken aback with pleasure at having somebody that was not fawning and being kind of uptight because they're in front of royalty. There was one moment that she'd gone in for a swim, and he was sort of by the luncheon table singing Marks and Spencer's, she gets her gear at Marks and Spencer's. He'd be dancing about like this, and the more she laughed, the more he could take a few, as he would call it, libos, with being a bit more outrageous with his jokes. And, you know, he could tell very risque things, and she enjoyed a good laugh.
Bindon's earthy working-class humour immediately appealed to the princess, and he was quite different to any sort of man she'd met before.
It must have been such a relief to sit and chat and listen to somebody telling coarse, rude, sexy jokes, because nobody back in England's going to sit and do it. You don't really tell those sort of jokes. I think it was probably great for her to listen to a real man, and he was a real man in his way.
As with any group of people together on holiday, photographs were taken. Bindon, wearing a T-shirt emblazoned with the words "Enjoy cocaine," was snapped next to Margaret. Years later, this image would come back to haunt her, because the man sat next to her, whom she found so amusing, was leading a double life. Bindon, who on screen always played the thug or the villain, was in reality one of London's most violent gangsters. And when he met Princess Margaret for the first time, he was actually on the run from the law. Bindon had grown up in the post-war slums of Fulham. Throughout the 60s, he'd served prison sentences for GBH, living off the earnings of a prostitute, and attempted murder. By the beginning of the 70s, Bindon was a notorious figure in gangland London.
He seemed to have obtained his income from protection rackets in the pubs, clubs, just going around into the pubs and demanding money for going away. He was involved in every criminal activity.
You wouldn't want to be on a receiving end of him, anybody. If you was on a receiving end of him, you was in trouble. It wouldn't go away. And whether it were 2, 3 years later, he'd never forget. And that was how he was.
But Bindon, the terrifying and violent gangster, had a completely different side to his personality.
There is nothing that will ever be able to describe how hilarious he was. People were weak with laughter.
He was so funny, you had to have like a 5 or 10 minute break and get away from him, because he used to make your fucking jaws ache.
Had fantastic knowledge of the strangest things, like the Navy and stuff like that. He could converse with people for hours. And obviously they found him interesting. And then, in the blink of an eye, you'd have the other John if something went wrong.
By the late 1960s, Bindon's Fulham and Chelsea patch was becoming increasingly gentrified. He began rubbing shoulders with actors and musicians who all loved his outrageous humour and genuine from the wrong side of the tracks pedigree. With old-fashioned social boundaries blurring, in 1968, Bindon met the aristocratic society girl and daughter of a baronet, Vicky Hodge.
This was my sort of first crossing of paths with anybody from that ilk. And I just found him hypnotic. I mean, magnetic. I couldn't resist it.
Although from utterly different ends of the British class system, Vicky and Bindon began a passionate affair.
There were no barriers and there were no questions, and it was endless parties and rock and roll and mixing with this body and the next body, and everybody just seemed to be having fun, and the last thing on your mind was problems or money or venereal diseases or AIDS. It was just totally carefree.
Vicky had discovered that Bindon was famed for being extremely well endowed, something that he loved to reveal at any opportunity.
He had these party tricks of whirling it round like a helicopter. He used to slap it on the bar. And it just used to, because I'd never known anything like this, I just thought it was frightfully funny. I didn't realise how kind of offended people were by it.
And he used to make it, it'd come out like a fucking fireman's hose. And he'd slip the handles, half-pint jugs, not pint jugs, half-pint jugs. And it was about, I think, what, four, five? He used to get 5 half-pint jugs on
get
it.
about 9 or 10 on there.
Oh, I don't know, I don't remember.
Oh, yeah, I'm
that.
telling you. Well, he had a foot prick, didn't he? Yeah, he had a foot prick.
Mate, it was like a baby's arm hanging out of the brain.
In the spirit of the swinging 70s, this particular physical asset had given Bindon a reputation as a ladies' man, and he wouldn't remain faithful to Vicky Hodge for long.
I mean, this guy needed 2 or 3 birds a day, every day. and he used to get them every day and all.
A sexual athlete, I suppose you'd call it.
As Vicky's love affair with Bindon developed, she would get to know him better than anyone else.
We'd go to what they called drinking clubs in the afternoon, where, you know, maybe the Richardsons were or the Quay twins were. And I didn't really realise that he was doing his thing that he'd done all his life, you know, buying and selling or doing somebody a favour or fixing somebody who'd been out of order. Every time we went there, I'd either have somebody pinch my arse or try and nudge up to me. John would just knock the guy out. And, you know, if he ever effing fucking touch me or look at me, he's a fucking dead man. And if something upset him that I did, or he'd start shaking me or strangling me or threatening me or punching me, I'd get some slaps. And I've got a couple of knife marks on my neck and in my back. But he just used to lose it. And his way of defending himself or making a point was being very violent.
In 1968, Bindon was talent spotted in a Fulham pub by the director Ken Loach, who cast him in his new film, Poor Cow. The part was a wife-beating small-time crook, but there was absolutely no acting involved for Bindon. On screen, he was simply being himself. When he was next cast as a heavy in the seminal British gangster film Performance, alongside Mick Jagger and James Fox, Bindon's genuine criminal background helped give the film its dark edge.
He had a substantial role in that, and he definitely contributed to a lot more than just the part you see on film. Bindon helped coach James Fox. His research for the role that he played involved Fox accompanying Bindon down to some of these hostelries in West London, where Bindon immediately felt obliged to get involved in some fights.
It's rumoured that James Fox went into religion shortly afterwards, after meeting John, which he may well have done. I mean, he could have that effect on people, especially a gentle person. I mean, he could turn you to religion, I imagine.
Yet despite appearing in several hugely influential British films during the early 70s and picking up high-profile guest star roles in TV drama, Bindon never let go of his criminal career.
The villain side of his life were the people that had known him from his early days, and you don't just dump your friends because you're moving with a next level up crowd.
In 1974, Bindon was involved in a brutal street fight and was wanted by the police. Coincidentally, the gangster's show business friend Dana Gillespie had just invited him to visit her on Mystique, and it seemed the perfect place to lie low till the heat died down.
And Jerry said to him, listen, you've got to fuck off, otherwise you're going to wind up getting nicked. And the Mystique thing came up about that time.
Yeah, it was, yeah.
And away he went. He went to Mystique.
So when Bindon turned sister, it was early 1975 when Margaret returned from her holiday in Mystique to the dull, strained atmosphere of Kensington Palace. And John Bindon's girlfriend, Vicky Hodge, soon found out that the princess was keen to keep seeing the man whom had entertained her so much in the Caribbean.
I began to realise that there was a very clandestine relationship going on, because the phone would go. There'd be a kind of quiet spoken voice asking for John Bindon. Not the usual, "Where's John there?" It would be like a, "John Bindon, please." And he told me that it was Princess Margaret's entourage or security ringing. And he was duly summoned to Kensington Palace for various parties and get-togethers and meetings with Margaret. Usually a black car would come to pick him up, and then he'd be taken to another car, and that would be taken to Kensington Palace.
I know it was said that Bindon used to visit her at Kensington Palace. Margaret could, I'm not saying she did because I don't know, but could have brought him into Kensington Palace as an exhibit, rather like a sort of bull mastiff or something that you show off. But he would not have been a permanent fixture. He just wasn't her type.
If he was going just to amuse her, to amuse Mam, that was his business, you know, and it didn't bother me because there was no aggravation surrounding it. It was all very well organised and very quiet and very circumspect, and I think we all had due reverence and respect for the situation, and if that was her choice, that was her prerogative. And they had many evenings together.
all the while these intimate liaisons at Kensington Palace with the princess were taking place, Bindon said very little about them to anyone. Although his friends knew that he'd met Princess Margaret and attempted to coax details out of him, the gangster kept tight-lipped.
Whenever it came up, the royal family, which wasn't very often, he would go out of his way to avoid it. I mean, he'd have a little laugh and a wink.
I used to say certain things, oh, I bet you've been at the nonsense with her and everything else. He used to never, ever say anything, just to sort of look away and sort of laugh.
He never divulged.
He never divulged.
It was never like, he'd tell you a story about where he'd been out and done this or been with so-and-so or rumped some film star, you know what I mean? Because he worked with quite a few.
Oh, he rumped a few film stars.
And he did rump a few.
Oh, didn't he just?
But he would never ever divulge about her, ever, would he?
Did he know?
And if anyone who tells you he did is a fucking liar.
Although Bindon was keeping quiet about the details of his meetings with the princess, by the mid-70s, London's criminal underworld had begun to change. Drug trafficking was now infringing on the values of old-school villainy, and Bindon, the debt collector, found himself caught up in the escalating violence.
Bindon got swept up by this. Yeah, the demands on him as a heavy were higher. He was expected to do and commit more violence. And it coincided with the Margaret situation.
By the time Bindon was getting to know Princess Margaret in 1975, he was doing little or no film work, so he returned to his protection rackets and debt collecting for income. Except now, amid the violent new drug scene of 70s gangland London, Bindon's methods became more extreme than ever before.
He said, hey, listen, Hodgie, we've got to go over to the Elephant and Castle. So I went, what for? He went, don't worry, just take me over to the Elephant and Castle. So I went, OK. And finally he came back after about 20 minutes. I went, "Where have you been?"
Right.
And he had a dishcloth round his hand and got this knife and threw it out of the window. I said, "What happened, John?" He said, "Well, I had to fucking take care of this fella." So I said, "What do you mean, take care of this fella?" He said, "Well, I had to cut his fucking arm off."
But whilst Bindon's gangland activities turned increasingly brutal, more and more people began to find out about his relationship with Princess Margaret, as the pair were spotted in public together.
A Range Rover came past and he said, "You know who that is in there?" I said, "Who?" He said, "That's Princess Margaret." I said, "Yeah." And she actually stopped in Milman Street. I said, "She stopped down there," and he ran down there and he was in the motor 10 minutes or whatever talking to her. But that didn't happen once, that happened 2 or 3 times.
Margaret's attraction to the more bohemian social scenes in London had always drawn her away from traditional royal enclaves, and in 1975, stories started to circulate of Margaret's being seen in a bizarre club where Bindon hung out as an unofficial bouncer.
They started meeting, I don't know if it was accidentally or arranged, at a restaurant in Fulham, the Gasworks.
Bindon and Margaret were seen in the Gasworks on quite a number of occasions. It really was an anything-goes place. Once you walk through those big wooden doors into this surreal environment filled with criminals, royalty, pop stars, you name it.
Nobody got any special treatment, and John had a way of shutting the club off a bit, you know, to a degree. You might have 2 or 3 tough guys at one side, you might have a few royals on the other.
I heard that John had actually had a fight there one day in front of Princess Margaret and wrecked a lot of stuff, and she wasn't whisked away. She stayed for it. I also heard that they mimicked a knighting where John got on his knees.
At the end of 1975, Bindon was invited a second time to Mystique when Margaret was to be there on holiday. This time, though, Vicky Hodge came with him. And on this visit, the gangster's girlfriend would not only see Bindon and the princess together for the first time, she'd see for herself exactly how close they'd become.
They were just very magnetised to each other, and they were obviously involved.
It was 1975, and the gangster John Bindon had arrived on the Caribbean island of Mystique for the second time, and once again Princess Margaret was also due to be there on holiday. Unlike his first visit, this time Bindon took Vicky with him.
John's been to Mystique the year before, and we get there and we spend a couple of weeks, and you know, we just hang out on the beaches and we're just getting really stoned and enjoying it. It's just so unbelievably beautiful. And Princess Margaret arrives, and so we all go, "Good afternoon, ma'am," and curtsy and bow, and John goes, "Oh, hello, ma'am, and how are you?" But we all address her properly as we've been asked to. Colin came to John and I said, "Do you want to come and have lunch with us at Macaroni Beach?" So we said, "Yeah, lovely, fabulous."
During the beach picnic of champagne and caviar, Colin Tennant instigated a performance of Bindon's infamous party piece for the princess.
Colin Tennant goes out to Princess Margaret and says, "Ma'am, you've probably heard about John's advantage in life." And she goes, "Yes, in a right royal way." And he goes, "Well, would you like to see it?" And there's a sort of royal giggle and gregarious laughter from the rest of us. And she says, "Fine." So Colin asks John if he minds going down the beach with Princess Margaret to examine John's advantage. And they walk down the beach. It's just so ironic. I try not to look because it's so farcical. Anyway, there's a sort of line of people going down the beach, and then they stop. So John drops his drawers. I think he probably did the helicopter move and flung it round a few times. And then he pulled up his drawers and they all came back roaring with laughter. And I mean, it had happened so many times before. It wasn't any different because it was Margaret. And then the lady in waiting sat down and said, "Well, I've seen bigger." as a tear crept out of the corner of her eye. And Princess Margaret seemed to kind of relax even more towards John.
Over the previous year, Vicky had been unsure of exactly what had been going on between her boyfriend and the princess. But when she saw them together on Mystique, she became increasingly convinced that there had been something more to their relationship all along.
We then went for Christmas Day at the Cotton House. And when Princess Margaret was arriving, Colin was throwing down the red carpet, and Princess Margaret was coming in the back door, coming straight to John. Straight to John. Because John was such a physical person, I'd become very aware of body language. And the body language of Princess Margaret and John was very, very solidified. Like my relationship with John when I first saw him, whether or not I was his girlfriend really didn't matter because, you know, step aside, baby, this is royalty. They were just very magnetized to each other, and they were obviously involved. But I was never privy to that because I was never with them in those private moments and the moments when he was summoned.
But the freedom that Margaret had once had to indulge in private liaisons on Mystique without the knowledge of the outside world was about to end. A compromising photograph of the princess with a man would be secretly taken on that year's holiday. Except it wasn't with John Bindon. After Vicky and Bindon had returned to London, Margaret would be reunited in the Caribbean with another man in her life, the 27-year-old Roddy Llewellyn. But the rekindling of their affair on Mystique would not remain a secret. A tabloid journalist had succeeded in getting onto the island, and an exposé about Llewellyn and Margaret's affair erupted in the British press in March 1976 and caused a sensation. This is the photograph that exposed Margaret and Llewellyn's affair, and when the image of the pair enjoying the Caribbean sun at the taxpayers' expense hit the British press in 1976, there was an uproar.
I was very much involved in this period when Margaret was very much seen to be cohorting with Roddy. And I think the British public were pretty shocked.
In reaction to the exposé, Margaret's husband, Lord Snowdon, instigated a formal separation from his wife. And despite the fact that he too was conducting an affair, Margaret was seen as the cruel adulteress.
Here she was, the sister of the sovereign, the supreme governor of the Church of England, getting divorced, or about to be divorced. Certainly the marriage had gone wrong.
In this atmosphere of public shock at Margaret's infidelities, the stories of her being on Mystique with John Bindon started to spread beyond the tight clique of the gangsters' social circle.
The criminals themselves, the friends of John Bindon, were incredibly discreet, while some of Margaret's friends found it all very jolly and rather funny to tell all their posh friends how they'd met this nasty, evil criminal called John Bindon. And ironically, that's where the source of this story came from.
Of course, people come out and talk, and a lot of smart people saying, "Cool, you ought to have seen the person that Margaret was with. This complete hoodlum."
But society gossip about Margaret and Bindon would take a serious turn. By the mid-70s, Bindon was losing control. Drink and drug consumption were playing a bigger part in his life, and his discretion about the nature of his relationship with the princess started to slip.
I got to know John Bindon in the 70s, and we used to drink together in Chelsea, and we used to be there with his friends mainly, and one or two of mine. Throughout his life, Bindon bragged about his prowess with women, and so unfortunately, even though Margaret trusted him and allowed him into the inner circle in Mystique, Bindon actually talked.
Because when he used to get pissed, he used to talk about it, and obviously went into some detail with, you know, where, when, how, and what colour underwear she was wearing.
Johnny Bindon, he boasted to me that he had had Margaret in Mystique, that she had given the invitation to go to her bed, and that he had willingly gone because she's a very, very beautiful and very sexy lady. And he assured me this was Margaret's proposition to him, not him insinuating himself into Margaret's bed.
But Bindon didn't stop at just talking about his friendship with the princess. He made it known that he was in possession of photographs featuring him with Margaret and began to meet with journalists who were offering money for them.
I remember once someone said, John's down a red line. So I walk in there and he's in there with two geezers. I thought that was old Bill at first, but it turned out they was journalists. They worked with one newspaper. I can't remember which one, it was a long time ago. And he said, they want to buy the photos. So I said, well, you going to have a trade? He went, no, he said, but we'll have a few light hours and I'll tell them to fuck off.
But in making boasts to the press about the Queen's sister, Bindon was playing with fire. The gangster was being monitored by Her Majesty's security services. And Bindon, according to one of his former associates, was told what the consequences would be if he continued to be indiscreet about the princess.
John came in the pub, he was agitated, walking up and down, which was unlike John. He wasn't his normal self. I said, what's the problem? What's the matter, John? He said, I got boxed off. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, some fellas got out of a car. And I said, what do you want? He said, Mr. Bindon, can we talk to you? They asked me to get in this car and I thought I'd better go with them. He said, then we got in the car, drove out the news, and ran all around London, little drive with me, the sights of London. But while we were doing this, they gave me a little talk. And they told me in no uncertain terms that the fact that I may have had some photos of Princess Margaret, of me and Princess Margaret, that if I or spoke about it or any of these photos ever surfaced, that I would be eliminated. And he said, I was frightened. So I said, look, if you've got any photos of them, burn them.
There's absolutely no question at all that the security services would have taken a huge interest in somebody like John Bindon, being so close to Princess Margaret. Of course, they checked him out from top to bottom. You know, defence of the realm and all that. We are talking of the sister of the sovereign.
Bindon never spoke about the princess to anyone ever again and claimed to have burned the photographs he had of him and Margaret together.
He'd say nothing at all. He'd clam right up and that was all you got from him. It weren't one of his party pieces where most things were. He'd talk openly and speak very well on most subjects, but not the rules, for my part. He had very healthy respect for him, and I believe that. I think he really did figure that they was a power to be reckoned with.
Although the security services may have scared Bindon into keeping his mouth shut, by his very nature, the gangster wasn't able to avoid drawing unwanted attention to himself and Margaret for long. In 1978, Bindon was in an out-of-hours drinking den in Fulham with Roy Dennis when John Dark, a South London villain, walked in.
He was known as Darky. He was a South London criminal, and he had been an informant for the flying squad. I'd never met John Dark until I saw his body on the slab.
A bird slung a glass at the barmaid, and I just stood up, being nosy, and Darky went to me, "Can I have a word with you?" He said, when that glass went over the counter, you jumped up. He said, and you went to do me. I said, no, but you're fucking paranoid, ain't you? Bosh, and I hit him. And it was only when I felt it running down my leg, I thought, he's fucking stabbed me. Yeah. Is that blood or shit running down my leg? John come flying over and copped for him from behind. Spun him round and went, leave off. Darky put it in him. But twice, I think, he put it right in him. John went, turn it in, for fuck's sake. Turn it in, you're the winner, you're the winner. And Darky got up off of him. As he got up off the floor, John took it out of his boot. It was like a bayonet. It must have been that big. Just put it in him.
And I said, look, John, you've got to go, mate. He said, what? He said, no, we do it. I said, you've got to go today. I said, you go now, you don't go tomorrow. It'll be on you. You won't be able to get out anywhere. And they went that night, and it all happened that night. And that's when he went to Ireland.
Half dead, Bindon fled to Dublin and went into hiding. But with the body of Dark still warm on the floor, the Met Police were soon on the case.
One of my subordinates rang me and said, "Governor, we've got one," which I knew meant a murder. The name Bindon came up. We thought at first he might have been killed and just spirited away or put in the river or disappeared. So we had to start looking for Bindon. More we heard, the more information we got, the more I realised that he was the main player. One of the papers got hold of the fact we were looking for Bindon, and that came in the press, and of course that went all over. Then I heard that he was in Ireland somewhere. I didn't know whether it was north or south.
The net was closing in on Bindon, so a legal team, put together by the gangster's underworld associates, established that there might be a way for Bindon to turn himself in, plead self-defence and avoid going down for murder.
Well, I know for a fact that 3 people went to Dublin, went to the hospital he was in, and met him. One was a solicitor's clerk, an aide to the solicitor, and these other 2 guys who were sort of the godfathers of Fulham, should we say. And they went and gave John an assurance that if he came back, pleaded not guilty, he would get a not guilty delivered. And he believed them, and he came back.
But Bindon was worried. The newspapers were full of stories about the hunt for the TV tough guy, along with hints at his acquaintance with the Queen's sister. Remembering the security service's threat about his relationship with Margaret going public, Bindon, desperate to prevent that threat being carried out, requested a private meeting with the police officer looking for him.
Got a phone call at Fulham. "George, this is John." You know, shock horror. So I said, "Where are you?" He said, "I'm in hospital in Dublin. I want to talk to you, George. Come over and see me." There had been mention in one or two of the papers that he had known Princess Margaret, or he'd met Princess Margaret. And he said to me, "There's this business about Princess Margaret, George." He said, "Let the powers that be know that I'm not saying anything."
But although Bindon had managed to get his message out to the security services, he also had more immediate concerns.
We had a dead body. And he had gone in there with a knife, and there'd been a fight, so he was charged. I charged him with murder, and we went all the way with it.
In December of 1978, just as Bindon was being charged with murder, Britain was on the verge of the winter of discontent, and the monarchy, with all of its expense to the public purse, was resented. Amid the economic hardship, Princess Margaret's lavish lifestyle and luxury trips to the Caribbean were heavily criticised. An opinion poll confirmed that 3/4 of the public felt she damaged her standing as a member of the royal family. With the press now beginning to link the princess with a man charged with murder, Bindon's trial would be anything but an open and shut case.
All seemed to be heading towards a guilty verdict. It all seemed so cut and dry.
I think the royal family were then still the royal family, the untouchables, the firm, and I think it had to be a controlled situation.
In March 1979, John Bindon pleaded not guilty to the murder of John Dark.
The trial of John Bindon was bizarre by anybody's standards because, you know, it shouldn't have even made that much in the papers. If it had been 2 criminals we'd never have heard of, I can assure you it would have been lucky to make the front pages.
In many ways, Princess Margaret didn't care much about herself, but she was incredibly aware of her sister, the Queen's position. And when Bindon came to trial, she was very concerned that any mention of her relationship with Bindon on Moustique or in Kensington Palace or in London should ever come out into the public domain or before a trial jury.
In the weeks leading up to his trial, there were several press stories about Bindon, the TV tough guy accused of murder. But buried in the text of these articles was always the suggestion of his association with Princess Margaret. So once again, Her Majesty's security services stepped in to make certain that Bindon wasn't talking.
I had a call from another department connected to the security services, and it was only an inquiry as to what he was saying about Princess Margaret.
Although Bindon had assured the police he had no intention of bringing up his relationship with Princess Margaret during the trial, the case against him was strong, and nobody really knew what he might come out with in the court if he became desperate.
We knew that he was going to plead self-defence, which was expected. But the evidence was there, body, knives, violence, and an admission that he'd stabbed her dog several times.
It all seemed to be heading towards a guilty verdict. It all seemed so cut and dry, really.
So the verdict the jury finally delivered came as a surprise to everyone.
He was found not guilty of the murder, and much more to my surprise, not guilty of manslaughter, which I was and not guilty of affray. And the affray was obvious because you had a dead person, lots of knives and machetes lying about.
It does seem extraordinary that he got off, in a sense, and very few trials of similar trials in the last 30 years have ever resulted in someone getting off like that.
I think the royal family were then still the royal family, the untouchables, the firm, and I think it had to be a controlled situation.
But the day after John Bindon was found not guilty of murder, the Daily Mirror, having hinted all along at his relationship with Margaret, published on their front page an extraordinary image. The paper had managed to get hold of the picture of Bindon and Princess Margaret together, taken when they'd first met on Mystique 5 years earlier in 1974. But with Bindon now acquitted, the Mirror was unable to print the headline "Margaret and the Murderer," and instead had to publish "Margaret and the Man Cleared of Murder." But this was bad enough. Although the Mirror didn't have all the details of the relationship between the Princess and Bindon, the association alone was the final nail in the coffin of Margaret's already tarnished reputation. From then on, she faded into obscurity.
By 50, Margaret was a sad woman, and nobody really cared much more about her love life or her happiness or the men in her life, because Margaret was yesterday's woman.
Bindon never worked as an actor again and effectively became a recluse. By the 80s, his promiscuous sexual lifestyle had caught up with him and he was diagnosed with HIV. He died in 1993.
First of all, we didn't want to believe that he had AIDS, and then people saying, oh, people are putting story about he's got AIDS, then you didn't think it was true. And then I found out it was true, you know, and it was, when I saw him, I didn't want to talk about it even, you know, to him.
We would speak sometimes on the telephone, and the old camaraderie would be there on the telephone. But I must say, I almost didn't want to see him, especially towards the end of his illness, because he was this big, shining Biffo the Mighty Marrow.
You're not going to get too many Johnny Bindons up and down the King's Road who break into the acting game and become friends with the royals.
Margaret's association with John Bindon was the last scandal she was ever at the centre of. She would outlive the gangster who had amused her so much by less than a decade. Like Bindon, the princess's latter years saw her fade to a tragic shadow of the charismatic and vital woman that she'd once been. But the fact remains that those who saw Princess Margaret and John Bindon together testify that these two people, from the most extreme opposite ends of the social scale imaginable, enjoyed each other's company immensely. Exactly how much, however, has gone to the grave with them both.
You know, you look at them and think, the princess and the hood, it is endlessly fascinating that they would even know one another.
He adored her. To the end, even when he never saw her, it was always, man was up there on the pedestal because he had his moment with her. And he could sing about her underwear, make her laugh. Not that he was going to in my view, get near the underwear. I mean, I only know what I know, and I don't think he did the biz with her, but he certainly made her laugh. And frankly, that goes probably a whole lot further than anything else would have gone.
She's only a human being. I mean, she was born into a privileged family, and John was just a man, however crazy and bad and wicked and good and mad he was. So it's just a man and a woman's situation. I mean, take it all back, and, you know, it's a very physical man and it's a very physical woman. And if they want a relationship, it's their choice.